Awesome. Well, I'm excited for this conversation today. We're going to be talking about something I think is really near and dear to everyone's heart right now. We are deep into planning season. I think for any B2B sales team at this point, you're really starting to think about 2024. 2023 might have been a great year, might not have been as great of a year for some folks, but we're thinking about coverage, we're thinking about capacity, and ultimately how we drive efficiency. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So really quickly, I'm Hayes Davis. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Gradient Works. And Colin, I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Hayes. And thank you, Jen, for kicking us off here. Colin Specter, VP of Sales for Orem. Been the head of sales the last 4.5 years at Orem. And we've evolved from all kinds of territory models, from drawing lines on a map geographically to now as a customer of Gradient Works the past year, really moving more towards this account-based and capacity model. So excited to share some of the lessons and hopefully help accelerate the learning for some of you as you think about your 2024 planning here.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we're super excited that Orem is working with us and has really adopted the dynamic books process. Today, we'll touch on dynamic books off and on, and really that kind of dynamic process of managing your accounts. But I think we really want to zoom out a little bit and think about kind of the three big areas of challenges that folks are really thinking about right now as they go into planning, whether they're using a dynamic books territory model or they're drawing polygons on a map. You really want to be thinking about, how do I select the accounts? What are the right accounts that we should be targeting? How do we think about managing that assignment and balancing, across reps? And then ultimately, how do we drive accountability? So we got a lot to talk about. We're going to try to cover all of those areas today, but let's get started. Colin, I'm curious, when you think about that foundational question, which I think shades into ICP and some other things, where do we focus? How do you start thinking about answering that question as a sales leader? What are you thinking when you start planning?
Yeah, I think, well, first and foremost, you got to start monitoring, measuring, and looking at your data, right? Everything starts with your data and understanding where have you had the best hits the past year, right? So, if you're starting from scratch, early stage, a lot of that's product market fit and figuring that out. But let's assume that you've got a healthy cohort of customers. And the past year, you have more than a few sales reps. You've scaled sales up to having multiple reps, multiple teams. Hopefully, you can start to look at the ownership data of accounts and conversion rates of those accounts across your team and start to look for patterns to inform how you want to refine ownership, principles, SLAs, who you're focusing your time and attention on, and try to get a good sense of what good looks like. And so, at Orem, in the beginning, it was like I mentioned before, literally dividing, lines on a map and, hey, you got the West Coast, you have the East Coast, and going through this transformation of focusing strictly on accounts. We initially started with a very rudimentary account-based model where we looked at like a few signals such as sales team size, industry, employee size, location, if they were business to business focused sales versus business to consumer focused sales. So we had some initial rudimentary ways to inform our scoring based upon some of the early customers that we captured. And and then we created some structures to start to measure different account level insights and data. So that way we can go back now when we're doing 2024 planning, we've got more fields and variables that we can look at to look for patterns across our healthier, customer base and accounts where we had the highest win rates, and start to understand, from a sales rep perspective, what the number of accounts they own and number of contacts they work, what does good look like for reps that got to quota or exceeded quota from those who did not in the respective segments? So kind of a lot to unpack there, but just
Yeah.
some of the variables and kind of evolution into how we're thinking about it today.
I think one of the things that people get, feel really challenged in is there are so many variables, right? There's so many different things to consider when you're thinking about this. It's a really complicated optimization problem in many cases. And one of the things I was thinking that I wanted to share in this call to kind of add maybe a click down a level from what you just shared, like that's the high level process. But I think sometimes people struggle to put that in play, right? And so one of the things we do at GradientWorks is for many of the companies that we work with as they look at adopting the dynamic books model, adopting our platform, we really help them, do a deeper dive on their coverage and how they're focused on the market. And by doing that for lots and lots of companies, we kind of identified a few sort of frameworks, if you will, that have been pretty helpful for figuring out how to think about those variables a little bit more. And so I wanted to share, as we're talking, I wanted to share a couple of those with folks. And so one of the things that I really like to look at here, and this is an example output, but I really like to think about when you're looking for your ICP or figuring out where you want to where you want to focus. You mentioned, Colin, this, what does good look like, right? And so I think about it really a lot of times, especially for an outbound or an organization that does a lot of outbound. There's really two types of efficiency you want to think about. One is, what type of efficiency do I have when I'm prospecting? How many accounts does it take? How much work does it take to actually generate that opportunity at whatever stage it matters to you? Like maybe you have a lot of stage zeros and you need to get a demo set or whatever the case may be, right? But there's that prospecting efficiency element. And then once you actually establish that opportunity, how efficient are you at turning that opportunity into what we all care about, revenue, right? And so I think about that as, looking at win rate, sales cycle, and those types of things. And so one of the things I see people do a lot is when they're trying to think through this, like where should we focus? A lot of times it's I'll put all my industry data in a pivot table and see where I have the most customers. And that's the focus, right? And it's a starting point, but I find it's really useful to use a visualization like this. And it's not too hard to create something like this, but one of the things that you can do here is say, look, for the segments I care about, and I've just got segment 1 through 7 over here, but this could be industry, it could be employee size, whatever it is. Look at all of the accounts that you've actually engaged with over the last year. You can count that up based on activities, usually in Salesforce, right? Then look at how many of those accounts you've actually generated opportunities with. And that gives you that dimension along the x-axis, which tells you, look, 7% of the accounts we engage with, we produce an opportunity, whatever the case may be. And so now you get a sense of like how easy it is for you to prospect into that part of the market. And then the other thing you can look at is, okay, for all the opportunities created, what's our win rate, right? And then you can kind of plot those two things. And you start to get a sense of, well, like in this example right here, my, kind of red segment, my segment 4, I'm prospecting pretty well, but I'm not winning, right? So if that's an industry or something, maybe there's a product problem and maybe I can't solve that from a sales perspective, right? Or my segment 1, the blue up at the top, pretty good prospecting, winning a lot, right? Maybe we lean in there. So when you start breaking it down this way, you can look at several different dimensions. It might be industries, it might be employee counts, it might be something that's technographic or firmographic that matters to your business. But it starts to like narrow this down a little bit, just give you a framework for thinking about it. So this is something we've seen that's been pretty helpful with our customers for starting to answer that question.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say like we started with that more rudimentary framework of just like, okay, let's get a basic scoring mechanism in place. And for us, the way we think about like account distribution, we operate our account model with some principles, and those principles are fairness. We want to just like distribute the deck of cards as fairly as possible across the AEs in the respective segment that they work in. Freshness. So we look at how long an account has been owned. and then continuity, in terms of if you've, had success and gotten traction into an account, you can continue that relationship with that account and keep moving forward with it. And so we design our kind of account and territory planning with those principles in mind. And so like before we met GradientWorks, like in my head, I had, I've been wanting to figure out like, because like you can't boil the ocean, right? The expression, right? You've got your total addressable market, you have your serviceable addressable market. But just even within that, you have, even smaller kind of pools that you can play in. And where can you be the fastest swimmer? Like what pool within the smaller ocean, the lake, within the ocean, the pool within the lake, can we be the fastest swimmer in? And what was really exciting, we went through this exercise with GradientWorks in our sales evaluation, was getting surfaced kind of insights that we had no idea about. We were focusing all our attention on certain industries because our initial cohort of customers came from those industries. But when we looked at the data, we had one of the worst win rates in those industries. And, through GradientWorks, we were able to find out, hey, you actually have a double win rate in this other industry where you're actually not, focusing your account coverage today. And so, there are so many patterns you can look at. And I guess the takeaway there is, you got to go back and look at a cohort of your customers and look at win rate, of course, but also, your healthiest LTV, customers as well, the ones that the ones that bought originally and you won with, but they stay with you. And what patterns can you glean from your healthy LTV customers that stay with you, renew year over year, expand with you? And maybe there's some patterns you're not even, incorporating into that score to prioritize those accounts, right? And, Hayes was mentioning, firmographics, technographic, like there's so many layers, but you can look at the way they do business and maybe there are some signals there, right? Like for us, we started to look at what kind of sales motion they have as a business. And for us, we're a sales phone platform. We call it a live conversation platform. So we sell to revenue teams. And so it became critically important for us to understand, for us, not just winning the account, but keeping the account and growing it, right? We're a subscription business. We want to figure out which ones we're going to win with, but they're also going to stay with us and create a healthy book of business for our company. And so we've added an element of what the customer's sales play is. Are they a high velocity sales team? Are they an enterprise sales team? What their go-to-market motion is? How big is their TAM? And a lot of folks look at revenue and industry and firmographics, right? But there might be unique patterns, as Hayes was alluding to. And the point here is, the score, like, yeah, you're doing this planning here one time, but like, you shouldn't be just one time. You're doing this upfront planning, but you should look at this information ideally every quarter, right? In a quarterly business review, and see how can you further impact your dynamic scoring and signals you use to surface the accounts that you want to fairly distribute to your AEs, or your sales team, so you can help your sales team hit target. The easier it is, you give it to them to hit the target, the better off you can just have them efficiently focus on selling and live conversations in those accounts. So probably a lot more to unpack there, Hayes, but yeah, again, just the way we think about it.
Yeah, I mean, so, but I think you touched on something that, or you touched on a lot of things that are really important, but, one of the things that, I really want to highlight from what you just said is that we talk about planning season, right, in sales. And I think that's really not the right way to be thinking about this. What we're trying to do is continually adjust, especially in a high growth mode. If you're if your company's been around for 25 years and you know exactly what to expect, great. Though I don't know if anyone knows exactly what to expect right now. But I think what we need to be doing is on an ongoing basis, looking at this as a feedback loop. What are we learning? How can we identify that? And then ultimately, how can we execute on that? And that's one of the things that I think is one of the biggest issues with legacy static territory models. Like, let's draw a polygon around some zip codes, and then we hand reps a whole bunch of accounts, and they're just going to sit with those accounts all year. you may learn so many things throughout the year that imply that you should be moving your quota capacity to a different spot, or reps discover certain tactics that are working really well and they can't execute those because they don't have the right kinds of accounts, or your product team delivers on a major milestone and you can suddenly do a thing for part of your ICP that you could never really service very well before, right? All that stuff is continually happening in your business, and you need to make sure that you're adapting to that. So I think that key point of continually adjusting this is super important. And I think, one of the things that I think about is, as you're doing that, and as you get into this process of trying to figure out how to balance all of those things, right? At some point, you can analyze till you're blue in the face, but you got to make some judgment calls. And as a sales leader, how do you decide at what point that is in the process, right? You can have everybody who's offering up their data points and their anecdotes and all of that, but at some point you've got to make a decision and say, guys, we're going in this direction. How do you think about that? When do you make that call and say, okay, we've learned what we're going to learn for this segment, let's keep moving?
I mean, that's like such a critical ingredient to leadership, right? Is being decisive. And we have a decision framework that our executive leadership team uses here at Orem. The full framework is called RAPID, and I slim it down to really three letters: RID. So the R stands for recommendation. Okay, what's the recommendation? What's the recommended change that we want to make? Okay, we are recommending that we no longer sell to the financial service industry because of the compliance that we run into there and the deal cycles. Okay, what inputs do we need, and who do we need to assign to gather the inputs in order to inform myself making a decision, or my fellow VPs making a decision, right? So someone's typically coming up with a recommendation. Maybe it's RevOps, maybe it's marketing, maybe it's client success because of a churn concern. Someone's coming up with a recommendation. You need to gather inputs, and then you need to decide decisively. And look, like, not every decision may work out the way you think, but to the point from before, Hayes, right? You need to have a feedback loop, and we use quarterly business reviews as a business and as a revenue team to go back and look at what recommendations do we make last quarter in the planning period or last year in the planning period, and what were the results of those. And so you have to own it. You have to have alignment with your counterparts in RevOps and CS and marketing. And so, yeah, I mean, two-part there, right? It's come up with a decision framework. So you're not just deciding in a vacuum. Sometimes, like you said, hey, you might have lots of different inputs from different stakeholders with different data sets. At the end of the day, you got to decide as the leader, or the RevOps leader, or the revenue leader. We're going in this direction. Actually, like I'm making a bet on financial services. We're going to keep going in that direction in spite of the larger compliance climb, because of the market potential and because of the initial logos we've landed there, right? So but that's a decision that you make, and then the team knows through the input stage their concerns were heard is also most important, right? I think blindly deciding and trying things without hearing the voice of the field or your fellow stakeholders, that could be more of a challenge. But you still have to decide, and you can't please everyone, is the kind of short answer there as well. Yeah. So that's the way we think about making decisions at Orem, really across the board, especially when it comes to strategy and territory planning here.
Yeah. What was the name of that framework again?
So the larger framework is called RAPID, RAPID, and I slim it down to RID. So recommend, inputs, decide. So the larger framework is recommend, agree, perform, inputs, and decide. So I move faster than the larger framework. The larger framework fits in a much larger company. It came out of some enterprise consulting firms. So we slimmed it down for our need for speed here.
Yeah, I was the reason I'm asking that is because I do think it's a key ingredient to stop you from getting into analysis paralysis in this situation. I once lived through a 9-month territory planning process that, what happened at the end of 9 months? it ended up sticking to the status quo. It stayed the same, right? So it was just this phenomenal waste because of the larger organization really was struggling to make those types of decisions. So you really do need to have a decision framework. But let's get let's focus in a little bit further in a couple of areas, because I think this is important. We talked about you know, talking about like where you want to focus, right? And you mentioned, like, one of the things that I think is kind of unique about what you said was that your prospects and your customers, the way they sell is a big factor in how you think about whether or not they're a good customer for you, right? And I think many of us tend to, you know, and I see this a lot, is people just tend to say like, well, we've got an industry tag, we've got a 6 Sense, you know, profile fit, right? We've got you know, a handful of data that we might get from Zoom Info, and then they just sort of take what's there, right? But one of the things that and I'll talk about what this grid is here in just a second and how it can play into it, but I wanted to ask the question, one of the big challenges I think about with ICP is like, we could spend a bunch of time refining our ICP down to all of these very, very small, like, critical things that we discover during the sales process, but some of that may just not be visible externally, right? That's what discovery is for. You actually have to like learn this in the process. And so when you think about something like that, I like, hey, we know if our customers sell a certain way, that matters to how much we're going to win. How do you think about trying to find like a visible proxy for that you could actually use as an ingredient into scoring, and not just something you have to find out during a discovery process?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Hayes. I mean, you know, having been with Orem since day one, really, where, you know, it was founder-led sales to now, you know, sales as a functioning engine and at scale here, you know, we're Series B at this point for the audience. I think some of it has come through kind of like gut understanding of what patterns am I seeing and feeling, like from across the different calls and different meetings that we've had. And then, I mean, you got to do like a cohort look at the customers that you've won, ideally like the healthiest customers that you've won as customers and that have stayed with you, and which ones have churned, you know, predominantly. And then as well, when you look at from a new business perspective, the you know, the ones that you've won and the ones that you've lost or that have gone through disqualification, like what patterns can you start to glean from them? And you know, having some sort of infrastructure to measure that is important, right? And, you know, hopefully you have some fields in your CRM like Salesforce. Over the years, we've continued to add fields to Salesforce around things that we've identified as correlated to a healthy customer. It doesn't necessarily cause them to be a healthy customer, but they're correlated, right? And a great example for us as a phone, as a sales phone platform is, you know, selling to customers that they themselves sell to customers that answer the phone and have a propensity to speak on the phone. Mm-hmm. And versus convincing a company where, you know, they sell to someone that doesn't necessarily respond to the phone at all. Even if we run a great sales campaign and on paper they're qualified, they have sales team that, you know, that like they have a sales team that could use the phone. If their customer themselves aren't going to talk on the phone, then they're not going to get a benefit from a phone system.
Right.
Kind of is a short answer, right? But it, you know, it took us a couple seasons to like kind of come to terms with that, because you see some great logos and great companies. You're like, wait, like why can't they be a customer? Well, the people that they interact with for their business, they're just not. They don't use the phone. Doesn't matter how well you efficiently automate it or make the phone great, right. And so it makes it easier. The best thing you can do is figure out who to say no to in the market just as much as who to say yes to, right? So like you can get your team focusing on that swimming pool where you can swim the fastest, and then you can operate a leaner team that way. You can operate a team that's gonna have a better hit rate, better attainment, because you've done the hard work up front to enrich based upon the patterns, based upon the win rates, you know, thanks to the tooling like services like Gradient Works, and other mechanisms like maybe conversational intelligence and other CRM, attributing services that can help you start to tag patterns, right? And these days, I mean, you could take a list of companies and throw them into something like a chat GPT and start to like play with requests to, hey, tell me some patterns about these teams and the way their sales teams function, right? Or the way their IT team functions. And you can start to get really interesting responses thanks to AI, on top of, some of the great tooling out there as well to help you get kind of an educated or smart kind of gut guess on what more patterns can I, think about here. So.
And so I want to, you gave me a really good tee up for this. So I feel like I need to, I need to point it out. One of the things that we offer with Gradient Works is a service called Market Map. And so part of what Market Map does is it's really meant to do some of those things that you described. So we have an AI process that goes out and looks at all of the prospects that you might have in your CRM and does some analysis on how they talk about themselves and the services and products that they offer, and then ultimately turns those into a lookalike score with your best customers and tiering to figure out what accounts are very similar to your customers. Think of it like when you have a really good rep, whenever you close an account and close a new customer, they're going to be going and looking and trying to find who's most similar to that I can go tell the story about this customer we just closed, go tell them this story, how we're helping a company that's just like them. So that's a lot of what Market Map does. So if you are interested in that, we do have a free offering there for folks who are listening in. You can go to gradient.org/market-map, and that will give you some of that AI capability to start looking at really unique clusters of accounts that operate similarly, as well as accounts that are similar to your best customers. But this is just, this is the tip of the iceberg. There's so many ways that you can start to incorporate this data. And so, one of the things that I want to get to is I want to get to, operationalizing this, right? We've been talking about this kind of somewhat in the abstract in terms of the number of accounts, in terms of like the kinds of accounts you could target. But when we start operationalizing it, we want to be thinking about where are we focusing, right? So we've got a sense of where the ICP is and where we should be focusing. We've got some tools to help us do that. We've got some analysis. We've made some decisions. Then one of the big questions I always have is, are we actually spending time where we should be spending time? And so one of the things that we look at is what we call a coverage grid here, which is to say, like, based on whatever segmentations that you care about, chunk up your market and look at your actual coverage levels, and do this with your activities from Salesforce as a great starting point. If you've got a product like Orem, that stuff's all going to be logged. It's all going to be right there. That you're making dials with these folks, and you're going to be able to look at that and see all of that in this type of way. And what you can get to is, gosh, we have, whether it's grocery or whether it's something more complex than just an industry tier, you can say, well, we're focusing here when we could be spending more of our time over here. We're not necessarily working on the best accounts. And that's where you start to find these pockets of quota capacity that you didn't really know you had. The reps are wasting their time on, not so good accounts in certain areas. And this is part of kind of what we found, when we started working with Orem, is there were areas where we kind of shift focus, right? It wasn't that reps were wasting their time, but there was opportunities to shift towards higher value coverage levels. And so once you start to see that, you can start to make some decisions about how you want to construct books for reps. And so that really gets into the whole kind of coverage and book composition question. And so there's two big questions that I think we always want to answer, which is, how large of a book should a rep have? And then you pointed out earlier, how do we keep those books fair? Right. And so there's two ways. I think answering those two questions is really, really important here. And so one of those is book size, and the other is book quality. So I'm curious, Colin, how do you think about going through and measuring what is the size of a book that a rep should have? How many accounts should they have at any given point in time?
Yeah, great question. So we look at it similar to how we look at activity measurement, right? Like you can look, like, look, we're a phone platform, right? So like I can look at how many calls a rep makes, how many people they speak with, how many times they keep that person on the phone, and then overcome objections and book meetings, right? So like there are conversion metrics at each point there. Now the step before that is how many companies, accounts are they working? How many contacts within each account are they working? And what are the conversion rates across those accounts? And looking at your cohort of reps that have met quota or exceeded quota, let's look at their account coverage.
Mhm.
And you can start to get a sense of what good looks like. And so, I might have an SDR that can meet and exceed quota working an average of 200 accounts at a given time, whereas it takes another SDR 400 accounts at a given time.
Mhm.
And so I need to understand, like, what are the differences there between these reps, and ideally you have enough of a class of reps to where you can get a sense of the median and the average there. And then you can know, do I have reps that are burning through my addressable market and they're burning
Mhm.
through accounts and they're activity monsters to get to goal? And
Mhm.
I have other reps that they're doing it right. They have a good balance of quality messaging and research and taking the time to sequence the right contact to get the goal. And so you got to look at just simply number of accounts, number of contacts, and the conversion rate of those two qualified meetings, and from qualified meetings into pipeline and revenue, right? How, like, what is their ultimate closed one revenue to what is their ultimate qualified pipeline and qualified and closed one revenue relative to accounts owned over the same period of time. So that can start to really inform things for you. And like I was sharing this with Hayes in the talk earlier, the warm-up talk, like my like utopia, my sales utopia
Right.
is the meritocracy, right? And what is the meritocracy? It just continues to reward the people that perform the best. And so I think the folks that can own the most accounts are the ones that can own the most accounts with the highest conversion rates and the highest performance numbers. And we don't cap reps at Orem, but we do have SLAs, service level agreements, into the type of activity they can put on accounts to keep them and how long they have to get traction in that account. And that's part of the freshness principle.
Mhm.
So that the SLAs help shed accounts from the reps naturally. So people can't just sit on 1,000 accounts and then make one call, to those 1,000 accounts a day or send one automated email. We're looking at the number of contacts. We're looking at the type of activities they're putting in those accounts, and have they been getting two-way contact in those accounts in order to warrant them to keep those accounts. And so that's the way we think about it. You want to keep an eye on burning through your TAM. You're going to have reps that are just activity warriors that get to quota with far too many accounts, and you have reps that have really healthy conversion rates. The short answer is it's going to vary by company, by industry, by segment. My enterprise reps are different than my mid-market, and my SMB reps are different as well. So your business may also be different, but I encourage you to look at a cohort of reps in each class
Mhm.
to get a sense of the ones that got to quota, and look at number of accounts, number of contacts, type of activities, and conversion rates to get you to just give a by and large sense of, because you want to prescribe to reps. When you come in here and work at Orem, I want to be able to tell you, in the strategic market or enterprise market, you should own about 50 accounts on average, and you should be working 6 to 10 contacts per account in each business unit in that account. And these are the sequences that we recommend there.
Mhm.
That's the foundation that they should start with. And you will have reps that go beyond the sequence, that do some unique things to improve their conversion rate, improve their win rate. And you should empower people to do that as long as they started with the foundation that you recommend. And then you can help learn from them. Like, what did they do different outside the sequence, outside the standard ownership framework? And then at your next QBR, you can use that to inform the way you set it up for the following quarter or the following year. So that's the way we think about it philosophically.
Yeah, and so I want to I love that approach, because there's several things that happen from that. Is, you know, our goal is not to turn reps into machines. Our goal is to enable reps to be as successful as they possibly can, right? And so what we want to do is, you mentioned fairness and freshness as principles, right? Like, what we want to do is we're really trying to set the rules here. We're trying to set the guardrails so that certain reps are not, consuming too many accounts and being successful just through inefficiency. But we also want to have some opportunities for reps to improvise a little bit, so that they can, so that we can learn from them, right? You need to have some of those new activities and different ways of approaching things. I wanted to, kind of, again, sort of play my role in this conversation and add a little bit of a framework for analyzing some of these things for folks. Now, this isn't going to capture the unique things that some of your high performing reps do, who might be intuiting certain things that they should be doing, but this is really meant to help you think through how should you find out the number of accounts that a rep should have. A couple of things I want to point out there is, you touched on this, Colin, but by and large, the number of accounts that a rep should have should be, in my opinion, the number of accounts that they can actively work at any given point in time. If you give reps more accounts than they can actively work, it creates a really interesting challenge that we've seen overall in many of the analyses we do. For those folks who do the once a year carve, you're really usually building that around this idea of revenue potential, right? Every rep should have an equal book based on a revenue potential metric. And what happens is, well, that rep in, who's maybe sitting in like the slightly less good geographic territory or whatever, you've got to kind of beef up the number of accounts. And so they end up with a lot of accounts, whereas other reps might have fewer accounts. And one thing that we have seen over and over and over again is, we do this analysis where we look across different sales organizations when we come in and talk to them about dynamic books, and we say, look, let's look at the accounts in each of your territories or in each of the books for each of the reps, and we put that across the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, we look at the number of opportunities they're creating, the amount of production, whatever that might be, the way you think about that, but usually it's opportunities. And then we see this fascinating curve that we call the prospecting plateau that happens, which is, you would think if more accounts meant more opportunity created, then it would just be a nice, diagonal line, right? And what we see is, up to a certain point, that is true. More accounts are necessary for some minimum level of success. But then we start to see this leveling off, where suddenly that relationship breaks down, and you don't get more opportunities by giving people more accounts. But then the most fascinating thing is, once you reach that plateau, we often see this downward curve, and you can see that in this example here, where you really start to overwhelm reps, and they just get these larger and larger books of accounts, and then they start to get less efficient. And so what you're looking for is the Goldilocks zone for reps, which is where they have enough accounts that they can actively be focused on those accounts. They're not spending a bunch of time sifting through stuff and trying to prioritize it. They're focused on outbounding to those. And so that's the prospecting plateau that we see all the time. And so people usually think, well, I'm just going to pad these books and give people more accounts, so they got plenty of opportunity. Well, in the reality, you might actually be reducing performance by doing that. And so we see that time and time again, and it's a little bit counterintuitive, and also counterintuitive sometimes to reps. Reps want that option to just hold on to these accounts forever. But the reality is sometimes that it's actually making things worse for them. And so book size really matters. And I think the important thing here to think about is, when you're trying to calculate that book size is, what we find, is a function of the time and activity that a rep can put in. So, Colin, you were talking about, like, what does it really take for good reps to cover their accounts? How many contacts do they need? How many activities do they need? What does that look like? And so one of the things that we have is kind of a calculator that takes some of that analysis and it helps you think through that from the standpoint of, if we have reps who need to who we expect to have, 15-step sequences with 3 contacts per account, those kinds of things. What does that mean in terms of what they can actually cover? And so you start to get a sense of what a book size might look like. And I'll just share some findings that we've seen across multiple teams, and consider these to be just pure rules of thumb here. And they're going to vary for different organizations, but true strategic reps who are doing really big deals and usually managing long-term customer relationships might be able to manage maybe 10 accounts, maybe sometimes even less than that. Enterprise reps, maybe 25 to 50 in many cases. Mid-market can usually go up around 75 to 100. And then SMB, which in more high velocity, those are going to be in your 100 to 150 type range. Those are just rules of thumb, right? Your data will vary based on what you're seeing with your reps, but I just wanted to put that out there to just say that in many cases, if you've got a bunch of SMB reps and you're giving them 1,000 accounts and you feel like that's the right number, it's probably not. It's probably excessive, right? And we see that a lot with folks. And so that just kind of gives you a little bit of a framework from what we've seen from a bunch of folks working up from the activity level. So I want to, what I want to do here is start to wrap up on the conversation. So Colin, I'm really curious, as you think about, moving from, okay, we've got a sense of where we want to be focused in 2024. How do you think about that ongoing process of throughout the year of 2024? We talked about QBRs and those types of things, but take me down to like the individual, like line manager level and rep level. How do you drive accountability, and how do you make sure that the reps are focused where you need them to be focused? Because I think we often define a strategy and then the execution of that may or may not be what we think is actually happening. So how do you do that?
Yeah, look, like it's a lot. The one word answer is alignment, right? It's you gotta have everybody speaking the same language and totally aligned with the decision that you've made when going through that RID decision process, right? So like, anytime we make a change to the SLAs, our service level agreements with our territories and account ownership guidelines, and specifically like going back to your Goldilocks kind of rules of thumb, like we don't cap the reps, but we do have SLAs that kind of naturally get the reps down to the level of accounts that they can personally work. And then thanks to Gradient Works, we'll top people off dynamically and automatically as the score of an account improves, et cetera. And so the meritocracy can start to take hold. If a rep's doing a great job converting accounts, keeping the activities, we'll start to top them off. So like, how do I keep everyone accountable? Well, I mean, in sales, it's really easy to measure the inputs, right? And I can look at the inputs of activity. I can measure the inputs of SLA violation and account ownership, and then of course their quota. And so I'm lucky I have really great frontline management. Like at this point, when I started at Orem, I was an SDR, AE, VP of sales, glorified VP of sales, and kind of built the value into my title. And now I have, frontline leaders and second line leaders, thankfully, that I, empower and trust. And we have to, we always meet and we align. And part of that's getting the voice of the field, because the best managers are always advocates for their reps. And you want to include the voice of the field as a part of the I and the RID, the input, when you make an SLA change. So if everyone's aligned with the decision, knowing that, look, we're going to make, like, I will make a decision, myself and my counterpart in client success, or myself and my counterpart in marketing will make the decision. We're aligned that we're going to move forward with that decision, knowing that the I was heard, like the input from the respective parties were heard. And it helps a lot more with alignment and everybody rallying to be accountable to that plan that we have all decided on. I think if you skip the step of, getting the input, getting the voice of the field, getting inputs from the other stakeholders. If you skip that step, then you might have people sometimes working against you and you don't have true alignment, and it's hard to hold people accountable. So I think for me, just to accelerate all of your learning, in my time as a leader, a sales leader, that's been most important, is like, you got to make sure that everyone is aligned and you take the time to really hear the concerns. And if everyone's aligned, then you have to set the standard of what good looks like. Okay, great. Now that we're aligned, now that we've looked at the data over this last quarter, we know what good looks like in terms of account ownership, capacity, conversion rates, how many calls the rep should make every day, how many opportunities they should have open, how many meetings they should be going on each week. You're going to have edge cases of people who do it way better, and you're going to have people that do it really, really poorly. And so you just have to decide what standard you're holding folks accountable to, and that needs to be aligned to. So easier said than done, I will say that, but it's communication and it's alignment with your fellow, executive leadership team and your frontline management.
So I'm really fascinated by this part of the process, right? Because I think in my time in RevOps and then ensuring that we're successful as a sales organization, I've always really felt like the frontline managers are just so crucial to success, because they're the ones who are enforcing what the reps are. They're the first line of communication from the reps. The rep have a question, you want to make sure that gets answered correctly. And so one of the things that I think is interesting is, we have lots of these conversations across everything. Whenever you're talking about go-to-market, alignment comes up, right? So what does misalignment look like, especially when you think about it with your line managers? Like, how do you start to spot as a sales leader, like, okay, hey, we gotta level set a little bit, things aren't quite where they need to be? So what are some of the signals to look for when that happens?
It's sometimes it gets surfaced to you through other parties of like, hey, someone else in RevOps might come to me and say, hey, that person's team, they're actually not using the new sequence. Like, they're still doing these kind of outside the sequence activities. And I know in the last meeting, we all made the decision that for this campaign, we're going to use a specific sequence. And so then I need to understand, okay, we all decided in the room together, we're going to use a sequence on these type of, leads and campaigns. I need to go and just have a conversation and say, hey, like, why are some of your teammates, members of your team, doing, tasks outside of the sequence or using the old sequence? Is there like just, you have to call it out, you have to surface it, right? And I think, it's all easier said than done, but this really boils down to communication and just reminding folks, like, we all got to be rowing in the same direction. And if we miss a concern in the RID process, in the input process, if we missed a concern of yours or a concern of a member of your team, like, let us know, but the decision's already been made. Like, the moment of that input has passed, and we need everybody to get in line to follow this decision in order for us to really measure and know and move forward. And if it's a bad decision, I'm accountable to that. Like, I own that, right? Because I made the decision with the inputs, but you can't have people working against it. Like, how do you uncover it? I mean, you can look at the data. Your RevOps team is looking at how the kind of work folks are doing. I mean, with the right kind of tooling and monitoring, you can get a sense, like, are they following the new messaging? With conversational intelligence tools, you can see, are they using the October war sheet, messaging that we've come out with in competitive deals? Are they following it the way we've trained them to, or are they still using the old talk tracks on those features? So those are just some examples. So I'd say part tooling, and just everybody holding each other accountable beyond you as a VP. You can't be everywhere all at once. You need your other lieutenants to help report to you, any kind of mutiny that might be happening on the front line or something like that.
Right. Okay. Well, look, let's wrap up here real quick. So just share a couple of things, and then I'd like, Colin, for you to have the last word, just to share any takeaways that you want folks to have from this. But from my perspective, I think I would just really like to say, as you're thinking about this process and going through this process, the big takeaways I would offer to folks are, build a system where the decisions you make today can be adjusted in the future. So have those QBRs, have this framework for how you make those decisions, because if you treat this planning stage as like, this is the only time we're doing planning, everything becomes high stakes and relatively low information, right? You want to have the ability to make these changes. The other thing I would say is, really try to make sure that you're considering, especially when you think about capacity, you're considering this from the bottoms up. What are reps doing today? Where does that fit with expectations? And then using that to make a determination about how many accounts that they should be focused on, what they can work. And then as a separate input, really from the bottoms up, looking at where you've had success, and take a handful of dimensions. Don't try to analyze the entire world, because you just won't be able to. Try to pick 3 or 4 critical dimensions, look at those, and then make the best call that you can make based on those dimensions, and then create a situation where you can adjust. So that'd be my takeaway. Colin, you wanna wrap us up here with takeaways?
Yeah, I look, Hayes, I think you nailed it. I think, look, alignment's so important. You have to be decisive. You got to measure. You got to hold folks accountable. And you want to shoot for the Goldilocks, like Hayes is talking about. We all want that utopia, that Goldilocks, and the meritocracy. Let our people be empowered. Like, you want to work more and make more money. You want to raise. Mm-hmm. That's up to you, right? Like, right. You put the inputs. You win the deals. Like, that's up to you. And we've got the infrastructure for you to do it. And just a huge shout out to Gradient Works. Like, I love services and companies that make me look good in front of my board of directors and my boss. And I thought, the Gradient Works team through the sales campaign and still today, like, really, they help me look good. They help me understand my business better, my team, my people better. So I can make better and smarter decisions with, things like 2024 planning, and start to look at more patterns to inform who my SDRs go after, how many accounts my reps should be working, how many contacts, in which industries, right? That's also important. So, and thank you, Hayes. This is awesome. I'll give one final shout out about Orem. If you're interested, if you have a sales team that hits the phones today, check out orem.com. We have a free trial that your reps can make some calls and generate pipeline today for end of year here. So
awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for the time, Colin. Been a great conversation.
Thank you, Hayes. Thanks everyone in the audience.